Joe, I have a question for you. Is at a high level, can you help us understand what is going on in the aromatics industry? Where does the US mainly source it from? And which are the end-use markets or the target markets?
Okay, so the petrochemicals, you mentioned the olefins and aromatics. The aromatics all have a benzene ring. And so first of all, you have to look at how the aromatics are made, and then you can look at a regional aspect and why there's been some shifts. First, you have to create the rings, and then you can manipulate the rings. So the single ring is benzene. You have benzene derivatives, the styrenics, which is a majority of that, but you have phenol, phenolics, and nylon. The xylenes is the other area. Xylenes mostly go into the paraxylene, terephthalic acid, and then the polyester industry. So all the clothing and the fabrics and things that come out of the polyester. Over the last 20 years, the polyester market was growing very fast, but particularly so in Asia. And now there's been a very strong dominance in China for the polyester. So almost all of the new plants, or a vast majority of the new plants, are in China. And the Chinese have built refineries for purpose just to make the feedstock for their plants. So they're becoming more self-sufficient. And 10 years ago, they had to import a lot of feedstocks from Japan, Korea, or Taiwan, or the United States, but now they're becoming more self-sufficient. Consequently, the United States has been decreasing other areas. India still has some polyester, but the vast majority is located in China. The unit operation where you create the aromatic molecules is the catalytic reforming in the refineries. So in China and Asia, you see a large percentage of the catalytic reformate going into the petrochemicals. United States, less so because we had more demand for gasoline and we don't have as much market in the United States. There's another dynamic going on in the nature of the crude oil that's been discovered and being processed in the U.S. refineries is more light and paraffinic. So that's not so good for making the aromatics through the reforming, because the paraffins don't make the aromatics to the same extent as if you had naphthenes in the type of the naphtha. The lighter material means you have lesser material that boil in the range where you would make the xylenes or the benzenes anyway. So there's been some shortage of quality feedstock for making aromatics in the United States. There's also there's a dynamic, the alternative for the aromatic side of the reforming is to go to gasoline blending, because the reformate has a high octane value. And you mentioned this octane barrel cost of the spread between the premium gasoline and regular gasoline. So regular gasoline is the baseline for all of the aromatics, and then the premium determines how much the value you're having to pay to take the aromatics out of gasoline to go into petrochemicals. And petrochemicals for sure has a higher use, and there are alternatives for blending octane into gasoline. You have isomerate and alkylate and ethanol. So those are all tempered, so it's not always an exact formula that you can predict what the value is going to be, because there's a lot of moving parts. But in general, the baseline for the gasoline is setting the floor for the aromatics price, and then the incremental value is the chemical demand versus the octane demand. In principle, there's a lot of reformates going to gasoline remaining, so there's not really a long-term shortage per se for aromatics, because you can always plug more out of the gasoline pool, but you're going to be competing with components that go for octane.
Well, I have a question for you. So if we talk about the light oil boom, and we think about like NGLs and ethane or naphtha in general in terms of feedstock, how do you see those dynamics going forward as compared to what we have seen in the last 10 years or so in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big headline is obviously the cost competitiveness of ethane as a feedstock for ethylene, right? I think I don't see that really changing. I think US will continue to have access to low-cost ethane for a very long period of time. I think if you look at the last 10 years, there was this phase when there was a lot of uncertainty around the sustained longevity of shale plays to produce ethane at the volumes to support multiple ethylene crackers. But obviously, the first wave of ethylene crackers came on stream. In spite of that, the US continues to import growing volumes of ethane every year. And on top of that, if you look at NGL production in the US, it continues to grow. A lot of people don't realize, but in the pandemic, crude oil production in the US fell, gas production in the US fell, but NGL production did not get the memo. It just kept growing. And which is why you've seen this dramatic addition of export capacity, whether it is for ethane or whether it's this dramatic uptake in LPG exports that you have shown, right? So I feel I'm very bullish about the ability of US shale plays to continue producing greater volumes of ethane and LPG. And to a large extent, this new ethylene cracker additions, the CP Chem Qatar project that was announced, for example, a lot of that is a reflection of that growing confidence in the petrochemical industry about ethane's production and long-term cost competitiveness. Maybe I'll pause there. I mean, Joe's probably has a better view on aromatics, but we can talk about that a little bit.
I mean, for ethylene, you crack ethane is very efficient. The United States has the supply, so that's the rationale there. But in reality, you can crack from ethane down to heavy gas oil to make ethylene. The heavier feeds make all the byproducts, and then there's infrastructure associated with those, and those have their own markets. And for the cost of ethylene, you need to look at the composite of all the products that you make there. So there's some regional differences. United States cracking the ethane has less amount of the byproducts. So in the past, we had a lot of butadiene industry and other kinds of hydrocarbon resin feedstock and such from the C5s. Now, those are diminishing and shifting elsewhere in the world, yet the ethane and then the polymers from the ethane are taking off. From aromatic standpoint, United States has a lot of benzene derivative infrastructure, so that we're chronically short for benzene. You can purposely make benzene. Benzene's a byproduct from the steam crackers. It's also you can make from the reforming, but the economics for producing that lend itself more toward importing benzene into the United States, but other regions have surpluses of benzene.
So if you had to highlight some of the key trends in terms of aromatic supply and the outlook, which would they be?
Well, the main trend has been shift toward China, particularly for the xylenes and the polyester, and that's because they purposely built up the fabric and then they back integrated into the chemicals to produce the fabrics. So there's a very large dominance in that area. The other aromatic molecules, benzene is the main one, that's spread out. That Europe has some benzene derivative and the United States still has some. All of the paraxylene and the xylenes come from refining. The benzene some comes from steam cracking naphtha, some comes from refining the reformate, some comes from the steel mills, a smaller amount comes from there. So the supply source is a little more diverse. The steel mill supplies is rather insignificant. The steam cracker cracking liquids is migrated more toward Asia and Europe is not expanding capacity, but those areas have more naphtha cracking in the United States just because the cost of ethylene is prefers the feedstock.
I mean, the one thing though, right, and this is more of a question, I guess, than a comment, Joe, but the US has been the US refining industry has been a gasoline machine, right, for a very long period of time. It was configured to produce as much gasoline out of a barrel of crude oil as possible. And as a result, it made big investments in catalytic naphtha reforming and all of this capacity. In some ways, the utilization of those assets is now declining because US is now, let me not say it's declining, but there's the prospect that some of that capacity may be underutilized going forward because US gasoline demand has peaked, right? Now, of course, what has happened is the US has become a massive exporter of refined products, right? So it's essentially exporting it into Latin America and some of these places. And that has happened because these markets are growing, but also a lot of their domestic refining capacity has been historically plagued with a lot of underutilization, right? So conceptually, if some of the Latin American refining capacity is utilized better and US gasoline demand peaks, then you potentially have the prospect of some of these reformers, naphtha reformers, facing the prospect of much lower utilization levels, which could potentially mean that you could open up that capacity to make on-purpose aromatics production as a feedstock for petrochemicals, right?
Yeah, so about the build-up for the gasoline production, you have a lot of other operations making the gasoline. Fluid catalytic cracking is a dominant one. And so you have alkylate isomerate, you have other things in the United States. You have ethanol that's been forced into the gasoline pool to create the octane. So the reformer is just a small part, and those could not completely flexible on a short notice, but in principle they could be directed toward petrochemicals or toward gasoline. So gasoline demand is still growing, is flattened off, and predictions are it's going to drop off. But all those predictions in the past for it to drop off, it still kept growing the demand. Anyway, it's tapered off. And people are not investing in gasoline production assets, so people probably won't be building new reformers for that purpose. But there's a lot of infrastructure already to create the aromatic molecules. After you create the molecules, then you have to extract, purify, rearrange the molecules if you want to go to specific xylene isomers, or if you want to go from toluene to benzene, or vice versa. So there are a lot of technical options to do that. But the basics of having the raw material are going to still remain with us in the U.S. The other thing about reforming is you have a byproduct hydrogen, which is useful for the chemical value for hydrotreating and hydroprocessing applications. And a lot of refiners run the reformers, balance out the hydrogen needs they have in the refinery also.
So if you had to talk about moving on to a little bit of the technology side, do you see an impact of new technology or the new innovation on the aromatic supply or overall larger feedstocks?
Well, one of the areas our company is working with is looking at where the aromatic molecules already exist. So FCC gasoline is one area, and the trend on FCC gasoline is to go to higher severity cracking because they want to make more propylene. If you crack more severely, you make higher propylene. But as a consequence, you have higher percentage of aromatics and higher aromatic rings in the FCC gasoline. Most people just go to gasoline blending. It has sulfur. They try to get rid of the sulfur, a lot of olefins and such. But we had a method to take the aromatics out of FCC gasoline. And the method involves segregating the sulfur and aromatics in one stream, everything else in another. So you still have to remove the sulfur to make the specifications for petrochemicals or for gasoline. But when we segregate those out, we don't lose any octane value by hydrotreating unnecessarily olefins to paraffins where you lose the octane value. So this is one area, a lot of potential in that area. The other areas are, you can look at methanol to aromatics, you can add methanol to toluene, make paraxylene, you can manipulate some things there, but those are not going to be a big mainstream impact. They may be site-specific if somebody has a need for a particular chemical and they have available these raw materials.